Okay, so today I want to talk about something that is kind of really important in context for us getting started reading Pride and Prejudice. And that is the importance of marriage and the standards for behavior for women in early 19th century England. So it's kind of really hard for us as modern readers to really understand the lives of young women during that time period because today we have so many options. Women have so many options available to them regarding the future. We can get married if we choose, if that's what we choose to do, but that's not necessarily, the norm anymore. No one's kind of holding your foot to the fire and saying you have to get married. We can go to college. We can follow any career path that we choose, and we can live on our own independently. We can travel across the ocean on our own without any big to do. So this is important for you to be able to understand the context here, because these women during this time period, early 19th century England, they did not have those same opportunities. So they were allowed to go to school. If you were in the middle and upper classes, you could be sent to school, but education really consisted of becoming accomplished, which meant that you would have a thorough knowledge of singing and dancing and drawing, and you would play an instrument like the piano or harpsichord or harp or pianoforte, and you would learn modern languages, which at the time would have been like French and Italian, possibly Latin. Then it really did of them expanding their academic knowledge. They weren't learning math and history and things like that. That was just not the norm. In addition, they were not allowed anything higher education. Like higher education, you weren't allowed to go to school as a woman for anything like post, like a primary or like a specialty school would have taken you probably to like you were 17 or 18. So really private tutors, governesses, and private schools were really the extent of the structured education that were open to them. Okay, young women like Elizabeth Bennet, we're going to find, who is very intelligent, has a nice, inquisitive mind. She would further her education through reading, but that would be done independently. They would have access to, if they were able to read, and they would have access to text, they could have access to text. But that was also limited by their financial status. Like, you wouldn't have, an immense library. If you were middle class, you would have opportunities to perhaps, you would have some books in the home. And I'm assuming you could probably borrow books, but it wouldn't be the same thing. So that was also limited. So Elizabeth, though, she loved to read and was continually reading and kind of expanding her mind. And she indicates to Lady Catherine that the education that she and her sisters had was unstructured, but it was really accessible. They could learn. Such of us as wished to learn never wanted the means. We were always encouraged to read and had all the masters that were necessary. So all the mega, learned minds that were publishing books at the time, they had access to those. And then she said those who choose or chose to be idle certainly might. So, it wasn't forced upon them. They weren't forced to do that extensive reading, but they could if they chose to. They had accessibility to it. And a little later on in our story, Darcy, after they're having this conversation about accomplished women, Darcy is going to comment that a really commendable woman will improve her mind by extensive reading. So that's an attractive quality to him that he finds in Elizabeth. So a woman's formal education is limited because her job opportunities were limited. Society was not going to allow a woman to enter the profession of medicine or the law. And so it wasn't even a consideration. There wasn't a chance for them to do so. In fact, middle and upper class women had very few avenues that were open to them for a secure future. If they were unmarried, they would remain dependent upon their relatives, and they would have to live with their relatives, and receive a small income from their fathers, brothers, or other relations that could afford to support them. In Elizabeth's case, she's really dependent upon her father while he is living and she is unmarried. But because of the entail which meant that her father's estate is going to pass to the closest living male relative. And the fact that she has no brothers, her situation could become quite desperate in the event of her father's death. So she, her mother, and her sisters would be forced to rely upon the charity of their relatives after Mr. Bennett's death, because the estate would not pass to the females. Their relatives like Mr. and Mrs. Phillips, Mr. and Mrs. Gardner, and Mr. Collins, who is the closest living male relative, and he's like a cousin. But this kind of position for these young ladies would be extremely humiliating and degrading for them to have to rely upon charity to live out the rest of their lives. So other options for a gently bred young woman who has some accomplishments. She could take a governess position or a position as a ladies' companion. So a ladies' companion would be someone who would travel with a lady, perhaps live in the home with a lady, and would just essentially be a paid friend, sort of, but also possibly having some menial tasks like taking care of the clothing and helping them dress and that kind of thing. Governesses could be preyed upon, though. So, like, there were obstacles to that that could then side situations that could be unpleasant or degrading. So governesses could be preyed upon by men in the family for which they worked. Ladies' companions might be treated poorly or given like menial tasks like changing a chamber pot, right, to attend to. But any other form of employment a woman could take was considered unacceptable and would harm her social standing. An unmarried woman's social standing would also be harmed by her living alone. So if they lived outside the sphere of the family's influence, they would it can be considered improper. A single woman who was not married had to either live with family or live with a suitable chaperone. Therefore, we see when the Bennett sisters travel in Pride and Prejudice, they're always staying in the company of a relative or a respectable married woman. We're going to see Jane visit the Gardners, who are her aunt and uncle in London. Elizabeth is going to stay with Charlotte once she gets married. Elizabeth is going to visit the Peak District with the Gardners, her aunt and uncle, and Lydia is going to go to Brighton as the guest of Mrs. Forrester. And so when we think about all of this kind of in context with the story, we kind of really see where, even though it's going to seem kind of ridiculous to us that Mrs. Bennet is so adamant that her daughters marry, but marriage would have been the only thing that would have really pulled them or give them any kind of stability and status in their life, because they had no living male relative. They would have no living male relatives after their father passes away.